Okay, welcome to this talk of the Pages TK Network seminar series. The goal is to bring together people involved in Pages TK and those who are not, and you know that TK Network is one of the longest running working groups at Pages. Were established a decade ago, and now we are in the third phase and preparing a proposal for a potential fourth phase. So you have some information and put in the link in the chat about the network in the chat. So today we are delighted to be joined by Dagomar Degroot, and Dagomar is Associate Professor of Environmental History in Georgetown, Washington, the States. And he's studying past interactions between people and nature. Education in Canada, PhD in history at York University, 2014. And Dagomar is using the evidence from historical and scientific archives to identify past climate changes, regional, environmental, and social responses. And his particular interest is in case studies of adaptation and resilience, so fascinating. We have details about Dagomar in this web page, beautiful one, lots of information, and you'll see that he has books, and one considered one of the 10 best history books of 2018 and many referred journal articles, including one in Nature published this year. So, and apart from book chapters, reviews, and I've seen that you have a special issue with the CRIS working group too, and also popular publications and impressive. They receive up to 1 million unique hits a year, and I've just pasted one of the links, historical climatology, and so there's also climate history and climate tipping points, student driving projects, podcasts, and many information there. So no more. And about the format, Dagomar will speak, and while he's talking, please, if you have a question, you're welcome to type into the chat window that you have a question, or you can just type your question in the chat. And you are also welcome to wait until the end of the talk, when we will have a discussion and question session. So with that, please go ahead, Dagomar.
Well, thank you so much. I'm going to share my screen. So it is such a thrill to join you all. Thank you so much, Belen, for inviting me to do this. Thank you, Sarah, for getting me organized. It's a special privilege to do this for Pages. The first scientific conference I actually ever went to was the Pages Open Science meeting in Goa, India, back in 2013. And I have vivid memories from that conference. I remember reclining on a beach in Goa at twilight and watching the fruit bats, flocks of them flapping overhead. And I also remember meeting many colleagues, one colleague who made fun of a giant mosquito bite I had at the time. I actually just co-authored a publication with him this year. So I have rich memories from that open science meeting. And since then, we at the Climate History Network and historicalclimatology.com have worked with Pages to cross-promote content. So yeah, it's just a real thrill to be doing this for Pages in particular. Okay, I want to introduce you all to an article that we published in Nature, the one that Belen referred to, an article we published earlier this year. And when I say we, I mean an international group of scholars in about 3 or 4 different disciplines from every level of seniority, from junior graduate students to senior professors. I worked with Kevin Anchikaitis, Martin Bach, Jacob Burnham, Fred Carnegie, Jiangshin Shi, Catherine DeLuna, Piotr Krasowski, George Hambrecht, Heli Hutama, Adam Izdebski, Katrin Kleeman, Emma Moswild, Narish Nupain, Timothy Newfield, Ching-Pei, Elna Zoplaki, and Natal Zapia. So a group of almost 20 scholars from all around the world. And in this article, first of all, we attempt to coin the effort, the study of trying to connect climate changes to human history. Now, this is often called climate history, this effort. But in the process of peer reviews and in presenting these ideas to different audiences around the world, I became aware that climate history is very much associated with the historical discipline. So we needed a new term to refer to this scholarship, this effort to connect climate change to human history as it's practiced in many different disciplines: archaeology, anthropology, genetics, economics, linguistics, geography, economics. The list goes on. History is not even the most important part as a discipline of that scholarship. So we come up with this term, the history of climate and society, or HCS, to describe that scholarship. So that's the first thing we do. And second, in this article, we identify systematic methodological challenges in HCS from its development in the late 19th and early 20th century, all the way through the present. Then we introduce a framework that, in our opinion, should allow scholars to overcome these challenges, or at least should help them to overcome these challenges. This is not, as we'll see in a few minutes, it's not a rigid method, a one size fits all method, but it is a rough framework that we hope that people in this field will follow from now on. Then we attempt to use that framework in order to develop or interrogate case studies of resilience and adaptation. So populations that successfully endured past climate changes, particularly in two little ice ages over the past 2 millennia: the late antique little ice age of the 6th century CE and the little ice age of arguably the 13th or 14th century CE through the 19th century CE. So we focus on those two periods of cooling and use our framework to argue that populations were resilient, so they resisted damage in these colder periods, and or they adapted, so they adjusted the structures of their society in order to cope. Okay, so this article received a fair amount of media attention, actually primarily in the non-English speaking press. So we got profiles in Brazil and in Greece, for example. We got some coverage in China, Poland, Germany, other places. But our favorite, at least my favorite publication that covered our work was in Grist several months ago. And it used our work as an example to argue that new research suggests that climate change didn't just cause societies in the past to collapse. It's more complicated than that. So if you want to read a little bit more about this article, you can look at that Grist piece. All right, so the history of climate and society these days is a booming field. This is just a selection of books published by historians in climate history, most of them focusing on the Little Ice Age, most of them published in just the last 10 years. It gives an indication of the diversity of topics that historians of climate and society, or HCS scholars, currently explore. Anything from examples of crisis to some examples of resilience, stories of understanding how people try to understand climates that were changing. And it's a very diverse scholarship at this point. And at climatehistory.net, so the Climate History Network homepage, we have almost 4,500 publications listed in our bibliography, many of which are in history of climate and society, are in HCS. So it's becoming a big and diverse field. However, many of these publications share assumptions and methods that actually go back to the foundation of the field in the late 19th and early 20th century. And the founders of the field, an astronomer, A.E. Douglas, on the left, and a geographer, Ellsworth Huntington, on the right. The astronomer, for the first time, use the width of tree rings as a proxy for past changes in precipitation. Right? He was the first to actually use a proxy source from what we call, of course, then the archives of nature. And therefore, he developed the first reconstructions of climate change dating back hundreds, even thousands of years. And he was inspired, prompted to do this in part by the urgings of Ellsworth Huntington on the right there. Ellsworth Huntington used these reconstructions to argue that climate change had long been responsible for the fate of empires. And he was guided in that belief by the idea that there was an ideal climate in which civilizations could prosper and reach their highest level of sophistication. So he published maps like this one early in the 20th century in interdisciplinary publications, books, articles, in which, not surprisingly, right, the most benign climates, or rather the climates that are most suitable for the highest level of civilization, are in the United States and in Western Europe. Maps like these actually have very old roots dating back to racist assumptions in the 17th and 18th century that eventually kind of coexisted uneasily with scientific racism in the 19th century. But really, maps like this had their origins in attempts to explain and justify European colonialism. But Ellsworth Huntington, early in the 20th century, deployed them liberally to argue that when climates left these ideal ranges, civilizations collapsed. And he used climate reconstructions then to argue that that had happened several times in the past. Now, this might strike everybody as a little bit outlandish, but actually you can see a strong echo of these ideas still in the scholarship of the history of climate and society, which at least the most influential publications, and in fact, a lot of the media coverage of the field focuses on case studies of civilizations that seem to collapse when climate left an ideal range. So for example, there's been a lot of coverage of ancient Egypt lately, the formation of ancient Egyptian dynasties. There's been a lot of work on the fall of the Western Roman Empire. There's been a tremendous amount of media coverage, tremendous amount of scholarship on the depopulation of cities in the classical Mayan and the Yucatan Peninsula. And perhaps most famously of all, the disappearance of the Norse settlements in Western Greenland. All of these things have been associated with periods of climatic cooling, been connected with, in many cases, periods of drought, mega droughts that lasted for decades. Right? So a lot of the scholarship still focuses on the collapse of past civilizations. And that's not, that can actually be shown in or rather, it can be shown more quantitatively. So this, this is a graph of scholarship written by historians just about the Little Ice Age in Europe over the past 20 years. So it's about 170 publications. And you can see, first of all, that there's far more of these publications now being written than there were 20 years ago. This indeed is a field that is booming. But secondly, you can see that the overwhelming number of publications in the field, the majority, are about catastrophe. And that's even the case in studies that examine the Little Ice Age in Europe. Those studies, I would argue, have been less focused on catastrophe and collapse than other studies because we have such a rich documentary record of the period, and very few polities actually did disintegrate in this period, in the Little Ice Age in Europe. Still, the overwhelming majority of the scholarship focuses on catastrophe and collapse. And to me, that's a problem, and to us, I should say, that's a problem, in part because we don't feel that that accurately reflects the true experience of climate change in the past, how people actually experienced climate change. What it reflects instead are systematic biases in the scholarship that are created by why people add climate change to their list of experts, why historians and archaeologists start studying past climate in the first place. It's usually in order to explain a major event in the past for which there's a great deal of evidence. a great deal of documentation in the case of historians. Most of those events will be catastrophes, right? So you're trying to explain something devastating, traumatic that happened in the past and incorporating climate change into the explanations because the social, political, and economic explanations for that catastrophe have in some way been unconvincing so far. So right in the field is baked in a bias towards examples of catastrophe and collapse, and also a focus on very large scales of analysis. So empires, entire empires that crumbled and collapsed, for example. Very rarely do you have local scales being examined in this scholarship. Okay, so that's one big problem that we identify in the entire field of HCS scholarship. Another big problem has to do with how HCS scholars use climate reconstructions. This is a climate reconstruction used by Ellsworth Huntington, I believe in 1907, that purportedly shows fluctuations in precipitation from 1300 BCE all the way through 1900, so about Ellsworth Huntington's present. And this is, of course, based on the work of A.E. Douglas. As you can see, for a paleoclimatologist today, this is not particularly convincing. For one, there are no labels on the y-axis. There seems to be some sort of smoothing with some sort of filter that's never described. And in reality, these are really not many tree ring cores that are being used in order to create these reconstructions. It's just a very small number of cores that are supposed to represent climatic fluctuations across all of Asia. So this is hardly convincing, and even for people at the time, this was not particularly convincing. He was building his grand conclusions on quicksand. So we like to think we do better now in HCS scholarship, but in many occasions we don't. And this is a reconstruction from the most popular book on the Little Ice Age. And as you can see, it's very similar problems. There's no labels on the y-axis. Clearly it's smoothed in some way. We have no idea how it's smoothed. There's no consideration of error margins here at all. And there seems to be some kind of basic problem in the reconstruction of the magnitude of the Little Ice Age, which here seems to be much greater than the present day extent of warming, or at least the magnitude of warming up to the year 2000. And we know clearly that that's not the case. In fact, I believe this reconstruction is based on the work of Hubert Lamb back in the 1960s and 70s. But this is in one of the most popular, in fact, the most popular book written by an HCS scholar on the Little Ice Age. This is a passage from the most popular book written in the last 2 years on the Little Ice Age. And here we learn that the Little Ice Age was a global phenomenon that led to a reduction of average temperatures by about 2 degrees Celsius. 2 degrees Celsius, which looks about right if you look at the previous reconstruction, right? But let me go back to that. It looks about right, but of course has no basis in reality, and it's actually a very difficult and dangerous thing to introduce to the public, because if the Little Ice Age cooled global temperatures by 2 degrees Celsius, why do we care so much about limiting warming to 2 degrees Celsius in the coming century, right? So this is not only inaccurate, it's actually dangerous. So in our article, we emphasize the uncertainties inherent in climate reconstructions, but then also how different reconstructions can use different statistical methods to calculate uncertainty in different ways. So you can see that at the top there. We in fact emphasize that different, even multi-proxy reconstructions show meaningfully different pictures of past climate change over the past 2,000 years. Right? They might show similar fluctuations, but they differ in terms of the timing of those fluctuations and the magnitude of those fluctuations. Even if you're just looking at 6 different reconstructions that all use tree rings, which you can see at the center here, they do still differ meaningfully. Now, they don't differ in the sense that, they don't show that there wasn't a Little Ice Age, for example. On the large scale, they're all quite similar, but if you're a historian or an archaeologist trying to link one of these climate anomalies, climate fluctuation, to an event in human history, these reconstructions are meaningfully different. And that difference has to be taken into account. We have to be much more careful before reaching firm conclusions about the impact of climate change on human history. We really have to pay more pay more attention to uncertainty. At the bottom, you can see different maps that also show the spatial heterogeneity, as we call it, of the Little Ice Age. So you can't just assume that this was a period of global cooling that affected every region at the same time. Of course, we know that is not the case. So we're really trying to urge HCS scholars to be much more careful in linking past climate changes, even the Little Ice Age, to the human story. So those are problems that, in our opinion, affect all of HCS scholarship, right? This focus on collapse and crisis, this focus on very large scales of analysis, so how empires crumble, for example, and often this misuse of climate reconstructions developed by paleoclimatologists and historical climatologists. HCS scholarship, however, also has two big schools of analysis, two big ways of establishing causation, which we call statistical and qualitative methods, but I think has been more accurately, more effectively described by Sam White and Cheng Pei as effective cause and cause of effect methods of establishing causation. In practice, these two methods overlap, but they're distinct enough to argue that they are two different schools. In effective cause analysis, scholars use statistical methods. They quantify social indicators, like, for example, the frequency of wars, and compare those quantified social developments to, of course, quantified climatic reconstructions, in order to find statistically significant correlations between them, which are supposed to establish the control of the climate variable over the historical variable. And you might use statistical methods and also to establish causation between those two variables. And here, what scholars are trying to do is establish climate change as a cause, very broadly, of historical change over large scales in time and space, but not a necessary or a sufficient condition in all instances. So in other words, climate change causes conflict, but not every conflict is caused by climate change. Okay. So this work has really been pioneered by historical geographers at the University of Hong Kong, who have quantified all kinds of social indicators from imperial Chinese history, from cultural efflorescence to the number of wars to economic performance, and try to find those correlations between those social trends and the climatic trends in imperial Chinese history. Some of the most famous work in this area probably involves the attempt to find correlations between temperature and civil war in sub-Saharan Africa, and then project forwards. We're trying to forecast how global warming will actually increase the frequency of civil war in sub-Saharan Africa. And that work has been pioneered by Marshall Burke. But there's a second school of HCS scholarship that uses cause of effect means of trying to establish causation and qualitative methods, which means the kind of detective work that historians and archaeologists often do. You try and find inferences from historical evidence. You try and make comparisons with similar cases and deploy counterfactual reasoning. So what might have happened if climate hadn't changed, for example. And here what you're trying to do is establish climate change as a necessary and a sufficient condition for particular instances of social change. So this war could not have happened, for example, if the climate had not changed, and the changed climate caused the war, right? So it's a very, very different ways of establishing causation. As you can imagine, people in these two different schools are often at loggerheads. They tend to talk past each other, although sometimes these two schools do overlap within the same publications. A good example of this qualitative school comes to us from Jeffrey Parker and his book, Global Crisis. where he goes all around the world and he finds accounts of people who are describing harvest failures that seem to be caused by the weather, and that then lead to malnutrition, starvation, migration, outbreaks of epidemic disease, sedition, wars within polities, and ultimately wars between polities. Jeffrey Parker calls this a fatal synergy that led to more simultaneous revolts and revolutions, he argues, in the early to mid 17th century than before or since. This is his global crisis that he argues ultimately depopulated a good chunk of the world. All right, so there's these two different schools, and we argue that they have distinct shortcomings. Some of them they have in common, some of them are distinct. So that statistical school, for example, as we call it, very often scholars take historical primary sources at face value. Right? So they're trying to establish, for example, the frequency of war, or they might be trying to establish cultural efflorescence, right, which is a much trickier concept. But they're doing that then by reading primary sources without taking their context into account. And this can be very, very problematic. It's actually how Hubert Lamb initially assumed that there was a medieval warm period, because he took contemporary accounts of warm weather at face value. Well, you really can't do that. If you're a historian anyway, you would usually know this. They also fall victim to the McNamara fallacy, where they either ignore what cannot be quantified easily, or they try and quantify that stuff anyway, often in a very problematic way. So for example, quantifying cultural efflorescence is very difficult to do. Even quantifying the number of wars can be very challenging, because it gets you into this question of what is a war? And particularly in the pre-modern period, and then actually increasingly now today as well, that can be extremely difficult to define. There's all kinds of simmering conflict within early modern Europe, for example, that doesn't quite rise to the level of a war, but also can't be ignored. Also, of course, it's very obvious, but trying to quantify the frequency of war tells us nothing about the quantity of violence. Right? World War II is just one war after all, same as a very minor conflict in one peripheral part of an empire, for example. Right? So in practice, it turns out to be very difficult to quantify social trends, and all kinds of subjective assumptions are required there that are not always, in fact, very rarely acknowledged in this kind of scholarship. This kind of scholarship can also ignore the fact that a correlation in one century between some sort of social change, again, let's focus on the frequency of war, and climate change does not necessarily mean the same causal pathway as that correlation in another. The causes for war might be fundamentally different in one century versus another. The motivations for war, how war is fought, might be completely different in one century versus another. So that is usually not taken into account in this scholarship at all. But the most important problem that we identify is called the streetlight effect. And this refers to the fact that if you drop your keys on your way home, you might only search for those keys under a streetlight. Let's say it's nighttime, right? Because that's where the ground is visible, but you won't be able to search elsewhere because it's not illuminated. And so this streetlight effect in this context refers to the use by statistical scholars of accessible but incomplete data sets without taking into account why the data sets were created in the first place. So you see this in many different scholarship and scholarships that use statistical methods to find correlation, and also then in HCS scholarship, where there's data sets being used that are not complete. So you really cannot trust the correlations and ultimately the causal arguments that come out of those data sets. Now, the qualitative school has its own problems, and the most important, in our opinion, is insufficient attention to uncertainty. Historians in particular are taught to make very, very confident arguments. And in fact, we are taught to avoid mention of uncertainty. In fact, I've been told this in peer reviews: do not mention uncertainty if you can avoid it. But that is a real problem because, as we've already established, right, the proxy record, climate reconstructions, do not allow us to make many claims with certainty about the impact of climate change on the human past. So we really do have to always be provisional in our conclusions. And that is often something that is anathema to the historians who often pursue this qualitative methodology. Okay, so there's all kinds of unique problems in every school of HCS, but then also problems that both schools share. So how do we get around that, right? These are problems that really date back to the formation of the field. How do we overcome them? Well, one thing that was obvious early on was that we could not propose a one-size-fits-all method for HCS scholars to use. The great strength of the field really is its diversity, as you've seen and showed those books, right? And you might already know this, many of you are experts in this field. But it's very difficult to think of a method that would work for 19th century Europe, that would also work for archaeologists trying to figure out how a gatherer-hunter group coped with the younger Dryads, for example, right? That was just a non-starter for us. Instead, what we came up with was what we call then a research framework, which is really just a set of questions that have binary answers, yes or no. And the questions are supposed to guide HCS scholars through the complexities of connecting climate change on one scale to environmental changes on a very different scale, usually a local or regional scale, and ultimately then to social changes, social responses to those regional and local environmental changes, ultimately to those hemispheric or global climate changes. And we've colored in different domains here. The idea is that you can start asking these questions in any domain. So let's say that, that you found some sort of social event that you want to try and explain using climate change, right? You think that you might be able to do that. Well, you've got to ask these questions first, and then you can kind of work your way through to climate change and ultimately to the regional environment domains. A lot of these questions encourage HCS scholars to think critically about the limits of their evidence, whether they are consulting the right evidence, whether they are taking sufficient account of uncertainty, whether they are really explaining all the sort of causal mechanisms that connect environmental changes to social changes across scales, right? But then most importantly, whether they are consulting domain experts. So if you're a historian or an archaeologist beginning a research project, and you're trying to use a paleoclimate reconstruction, are you consulting are you consulting paleoclimatologists? Are you asking them if you're actually using these reconstructions in the right way? Are you assuming that a smooth reconstruction shows a genuine trend or anomaly? You should probably ask someone about that. Similarly, if you're a paleoclimatologist, you've got these wonderful climate reconstructions and you know exactly how to use them. Are you sure you're not just making assumptions about how those paleoclimatic reconstructions, how the climate changes in them influence society? Or are you actually finding causal mechanisms with the right ensemble of sources? Right? So now, it's possible for one scholar to work their way through these questions. Let's say a historian works their way through these questions, consults paleoclimatologists. Often it's a publishing model in the historical discipline that a single historian has to single author a publication. That's how it's done. You get most credit for that. But really what we're calling for, what we think is so important, is whenever possible for scholars in different disciplines to work together as a collaborative team, as what's often called a consilient team. And this is really a concept that goes back several years now to work by John Halden, Timothy Neufeld, Adam Izdebski, and even before that, E.O. Wilson, the idea of consilience. With these sorts of partnerships, in practice, have often had a big problem, which is that scholars in one discipline, let's say paleoclimatology, conceive of a project, and then at the very end of that project, invite in a historian or an archaeologist to add maybe a little bit of depth to their attempts to connect climate change to human history. We're calling for something different. In fact, we tried to model something different, which is scholars in roughly equal numbers joining together to conceive of projects from the ground up. So together they imagine a project and then see it through to the end as a group. That's what we did. This is one of our first meetings. You can see Kevin Enchikaitis and Eleanor Zoplaki on the left, and then Catherine DeLuna and Martin Bach on the right. Scholars from different disciplines getting together, in our case, coming up with this project. And so together, we came up with case studies from all over the world of populations that were resilient and adaptive to little ice ages. And we were able to either identify these case studies or interrogate them and refine them using our framework. We find that our framework is particularly good for allowing scholars to uncover kind of subtle connections between climate changes and human history. And then we identify in all our case studies 5 big pathways by which populations could be resilient in the face of climatic pressures. So either they could exploit the opportunities of transformed local environments, or they could make use of or develop energy systems that were resilient to the local environmental manifestations of climate change. They might be able to make use of diverse resources through trade or through inter-imperial networks, intra-imperial networks. Or they could have political and institutional adaptations that allowed them to cope with climate anomalies more effectively the second time they came around. Or they could even transform their society largely through migration, right? So we draw attention to these 5 different pathways, although we emphasize that these are not the only pathways you could find. There are many other ways, in our opinion, in which populations could be resilient and adaptive to climatic pressures. But really, the key for us can be found in the supplementary information of our article. The key was in how we together interrogated these case studies using our methodology. So the one thing at the very start that we emphasize is that these are not just resilient societies. They are populations within societies that were resilient, sometimes at the expense of other populations that were then made more vulnerable. So we take pains to identify the population within each polity that seems to have been resilient. And then we also identify the challenges of the climate reconstructions that we used for each case study. So, for example, maybe there's a lack of resolution. Maybe we can't find proxy records from natural archives, only the archives of society, in other words, only documents. Or maybe we're not quite sure that we have all the different kinds of proxy sources from the archives of nature that we could be deploying. So we're very upfront about identifying the weaknesses, in our opinion, in the reconstructions that we're using for each case studies. Such weaknesses are unavoidable, by the way. There's always, in our opinion, a deficit of information that you have to kind of cope with as well as you can. But then also, we identify major problems that we found in every single case study. And those are the case studies that we accepted. We actually also rejected a few case studies because we could not agree that they all establish causation convincingly. That's part of our framework as well. If you can't answer those questions satisfactorily, you should often abandon the research project. That's something we recommend. But we show how, in particular, small group, myself, Kevin Enchikaitis, how we went through each case study, identified potential causal problems with that case study, or elements of that case study that did not seem convincing, and then how everybody tried to resolve them. And in the process of resolving them, which took a long time, ultimately created, in many cases, more convincing case studies of populations that endured climate change. Just to very briefly give you an example from my own work, because I certainly took some lumps as well through this process. It requires a certain amount of humility, as you can imagine. But I had argued in my book from 2018 and some of my other work that precipitation increased across the Low Countries in the late 16th century through the early 17th century during a particularly cold regional phase of the Little Ice Age, and that this increased precipitation thwarted efforts by the Spanish Empire to regain the rebellious provinces of the Low Countries that ultimately declare themselves the Dutch Republic. And I base this on a great deal of documentary evidence. So reports of flooding, for example, partly assembled by other scholars like Elizabeth Gottschalk. Anecdotal accounts, for the most part, of tremendous floods, heavy rainfall interfering with military operations, some of which you can see in existing pamphlets from the period. I mapped it out. This is a map of major battles during that Spanish effort to reclaim those rebellious provinces that became the Dutch Republic. In almost every battle in the late 16th and early 17th century, it was cold and wet. But really, as Kevin Anchikaitis pointed out to me, there's a scattershot quality about this evidence, right? You're relying on anecdotal evidence, often just a few dozen reports assembled over many years. This is not uncommon for historians to do, but when you're trying to publish something interdisciplinary, when you're trying to publish in a scientific journal, that no longer works so well. So Kevin Anchikaitis developed this Palmer Drought Severity Index reconstruction for the Low Countries that mercifully, I was very relieved, it shows that indeed precipitation did seem, and wetness did seem to be greater in the late 16th and early 17th century than it was in many other periods. Roughly verifying what I found with the Archives of Society then. Right? So the Archives of Nature and the Archives of Society more or less agree. But as you can imagine, this was a difficult process and a bit of a tense process as well, to get this evidence and just to work through this evidence. And in some cases, we found that the proxy evidence really did not match what the case studies were attempting to argue. And so we either had to drop those case studies or revise their conclusions. Okay, so yes, and so deliberate inundations deliberate flooding by Dutch rebels that allowed the Dutch rebels to ward off the Spanish Empire indeed benefited from increased precipitation. But all right, some conclusions here. We argue that there are long-standing challenges in HCS scholarship, and we argue that these challenges can be addressed most effectively through collaborations that work through our framework, right, to emphasize uncertainty, to emphasize the problems of bridging scale, and to emphasize really establishing causal mechanisms as well as possible, and not making the kind of assumptions that have often bedeviled this kind of scholarship, again, all the way from Ellsworth, Huntington, pretty much through the present. And we believe that the framework we have introduced is well suited to uncover relatively subtle examples of connections between climate change and social change, which in turn might allow for more scholarship on resilience and adaptation, which is often difficult to find in the historical record. It's easier to find examples of collapse and catastrophe. Maybe this framework that we've introduced will allow scholars to think in a more diverse way about the history of climate and society. Okay, thank you so much. I'll stop sharing now, and I look forward to your questions.
I see everyone is It's saying there a wonderful, wonderful presentation. Thank you very much, Dagmar. I think, yes, I think we have about 15 minutes for questions, so it's great. If you have, I repeat, if you have a question, please feel free to use the chat or raise your hand or open your mic. And I see that we have already a question. Graham, maybe you can open your mic and just go ahead and ask your question directly.
Sure. Hello. Thanks. Hi, Belen, by the way. And thank you, Dagmar. Very fascinating talk. And I think this is a wonderful field, and it's nice to see that it's changing and evolving in various ways. My question that I posed in the chat, it's rather long, but maybe to make it short, I'm really thinking about human health as one of the ways to perhaps engage society more on the issue of climate change. And I'm wondering, could this field of research take sort of a shift in emphasis or focus very explicitly in the direction of climate change impacts that are very directly tied to human health? Or is it perhaps too easily confused with catastrophe, more broadly speaking? Or is the topic of health just too complex and difficult from the paleo perspective to do that? I don't know. Thanks.
That's a really fascinating question. Health does enter the scholarship of HCS scholarship in a few different ways. First, I would say I actually showed a graph earlier in my presentation that I didn't really describe, but it was a graph of the height of French men during the 17th century, a graph from Geoffrey Parker's Global Crisis. And the height of French men in that book is supposed to be a proxy for their health and in turn their nutrition levels. So there's an example of one way in which health enters this field. I would say in a, it's not a completely satisfying way, I'll put it that way. Another example is the emphasis on the climatic causes for past epidemics. The plague of Justinian in the 6th century, for example, is often linked to the onset of the late antique Little Ice Age. Waves of plague during the Little Ice Age proper are also occasionally linked to climatic anomalies. And in fact, the Black Death in the first place in the 14th century, it is also linked to drought in Central Asia.
Yeah.
So there are attempts to link epidemics to climatic anomalies. Also endemics to some example, or to some extent, typhus, for example, is a disease that is often linked to the Little Ice Age because it's spread, I believe, by lice. And the argument goes, well, if you've got thicker clothing on, those lice can replicate more easily. As you can probably tell, though, this is not this suffers from the same kinds of problems that we identify in our article. In fact, perhaps it's a particularly egregious example of some of those problems. There's a lot of assumptions being made.
Yeah.
There's quite a bit of determinism, and health as something broader than just epidemics is something that I think is still not adequately examined by scholars. Now health is of course very difficult to get at when you're looking hundreds of years into the past.
Yes, of course.
But I think there's a lot of room for more research.
Yeah, great, thank you.
Thank you, Graham. Oh, I see Bashnet. Do you want, have you a question for Dagomar? Oh, maybe you're just showing your camera. Oh, but I see your hand. Can you hear us, Bashnet?
Yeah,
Otherwise,
please. Yeah, of course, I can hear you.
Great. Please go ahead with your question, please.
Yeah. I'm from India, Kashmir, Indian occupied Kashmir. So we have a good history of about 5,000 years, written as Rajtarangani, which has been written in 1148, going back to 3,000 years. And then from 1148, it has been continued down until now by the different scholars. It is a rich source. What my question is that you have shown that different little ice age and then warm ages. Have you correlated it globally? What you have seen, Doug, about this, its global scenario? Has it been globally, or I have seen either way around? What I have seen in Kashmir, our climate somewhat relates to the Europe, but the rest of the India, whenever there has been a cold or little ice ages in Europe, it is a similar situation is Kashmir, but not in rest of the Indian peninsula. There have been always droughts. Have you studied such a thing, such a what I say, canonical or uncanonical things, uncanonical positions? Have you studied those things in your research?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. What I would say is that Indian history of climate and society, so in Indian HCS studies, in my impression, much like Indian paleoclimatology, is booming. And there have been many really exciting publications written in Indian HCS in just the last few years by Sugata Ray, for example, or by Debjani Bhattacharya. Sorry if I'm butchering that name, but there's been some really exciting scholarship to come out of India recently. A lot of it is on the more recent period, on the Little Ice Age, going down through the 19th century. There has been great scholarship by archaeologists on much earlier periods, thousands of years ago, the Indus civilization, for example, and its resilience in the face of climatic challenges. But in general, there is still an enormous amount that needs to be done on HCS scholarship beyond its traditional hotbeds, which is China and Western Europe. There's still an enormous amount that needs to be done. And so really in many other parts of the world, I'm thinking sub-Saharan Africa, before the 19th century, much of the Indian subcontinent is a great example of that. There's room for far more HCS scholarship. So this, in many respects, even though the field is booming now, it really is still in its infancy. So yeah, there's much more that needs to be done.
Yes, thank you. Yes, just a minute, Rehan. You had her hand raised a while ago. Can you pose your question?
Hi, thank you for.
okay.
Hi, zoom in from Ann Arbor. Thank you for your talk. And actually, I just pick up my questions a little bit similar to the previous questions. And actually, Dagomar already mentioned something. I just wonder if you can comment on the unbalance in the amount of similar scholarship on Western societies and non-Western societies. And I wonder if, like, on the process of your doing work, how you reach out to, like, people who do, say, Asian studies. And I know that for climate history now in Asian studies, like you said, it is really a big booming. And I also see kind of clusters, like, say, when I talk to people who do with like a paleo climate, that kind of approaches, you see, like, people who work with Chinese data seems to be like a cluster. People who work with Japan materials are people who work with Indian material, and like very small number of scholars who do with mainland Southeast Asia. So I wonder, you can see any probably advice or tips, or how you kind of thinking the way that people can, come together, not just across disciplines, but also cross regions in this perspective? Thank you.
Yeah, it's a really important, really great question. So I can just tell you how I've tried to do it in my career. And I guess that goes back to 2010, which is when we set up the Climate History Network exactly for this reason. And you know what? Maybe I should go back a little bit further than that and think about the field more broadly to describe very, very briefly why there is this imbalance in the first place. Then I'll talk about how I've tried to overcome it in my work. So the imbalance results from a number of different factors. Some of them are more problematic than others. So part of the issue is the global distribution of paleoclimatic evidence of a high resolution, right? So for example, you've got a lot of tree ring evidence for Europe, right? Very little, in fact, if any, for sub-Saharan Africa, right? So you can do different kinds of HCS scholarship in Europe than you might be able to do in sub-Saharan Africa. In Europe and in China, there's a very long record of documentary sources that you can access, right? From in Europe, pretty much since the high medieval centuries, and in some respects much earlier than that. In China, much longer still. That allows you to, for example, do this kind of statistical correlation work in a Chinese context, which you could not do nearly as easily in another region. Right? In Europe, you see less of that kind of work, in part because documentary evidence doesn't go back as far. But here there are there's very rich qualitative documentation that you can use if you're a historian for HCS scholarship. So there's a reason there as well that you see more concentration in these two different regions. There's also the whole issue of obviously it's a justice issue, right? The global distribution of wealth and where this kind of research, which can require a lot of money, can be located in the first place, right? So there's a reason that we see it take root in these rich societies, and still there's that kind of imbalance, right? There's sometimes this kind of proxy work that you need to do in order to make the HCS scholarship possible takes many thousands of dollars, right? Even millions of dollars. So that's possible in some regions, not others, because of the global inequalities in wealth. And then there's also just where these pioneers of these fields were based. David Zhang is a pioneer in statistical scholarship. Well, he was based in Hong Kong, right? So Christian Pfister, Hubert Lamb, Emmanuel Leroy-Ladurie, these are pioneers in HCS scholarship on the historical side. Well, they are based across Europe. So there's some kind of historical contingency, I guess, there as well, where people just happen to be in certain places at certain times. Okay, so how have I tried to overcome some of these challenges in my work? Well, we set up the Climate History Network in 2010 with the explicit idea of reaching out to scholars in different disciplines, but also internationally, bringing them together in sort of a shared forum. PAGES does this on a much bigger scale for the paleoclimate community. We try and do it for the HCS community. So we've got several hundred people now in the Climate History Network who are scattered all over the world. And we've got their profiles listed on our website at climatehistory.net. So if you want to do something on, let's say, Chinese climate history, or better yet, if you want to do a comparative approach, right? If you want to take a global approach like we tried to do to some extent in our article, you've got all kinds of people now that you can contact easily just by looking at our member list at the Climate History Network. I also try to go to conferences, most importantly for me, the Open Science meeting in India, actually, but I traveled to China, I traveled to India. I'll soon be traveling to Seoul, COVID permitting, but to meet scholars in these different places, to try and connect with them. This is much more possible now, of course, with Zoom, I think, as well, and you save a lot of carbon emissions that way too. But it's possible to reach out to people, and if you do, you find that there's thriving HCS communities in many different countries. That has changed, I think, a lot actually in the last 10 years. I do think the field has become much more international. I think that part of the reason is because of organizations like PAGES. I think it's also because concern, obviously, about global warming is one of the prime motivators now for a great deal of scholarship. And that is international, right? So we see this field, I think, becoming much more international than it used to be. And that opens more possibilities for collaboration across countries as well. So yeah, it's much more possible to do what you're suggesting now than it used to be.
Thank you, Dagomar. I think we have time for squeezing one more question because Reinhard has been. Can you go ahead? And it will be the last question because we tried to fit this in
Just
1 hour.
A quick comment and a big thank you to Dagomar for this very stimulating talk. Greetings from Quebec City, Canada. I'm most involved in paleolimnological studies, and your talk really reminded me of my visit to the Warsaw Museum, the Chopin Museum, and echoing the comment from Graham Morton is that we can tease out so much information on human health issues due to climate change from written documents. Chopin, who's describing his miserable health condition in Paris, where he lived, humidity, coldness during the Middle Ice Age, and his attempt to escape to find refuge in Mallorca and so on, and the situation which you mentioned, typhus epidemics and so on. So this is the first comment. And secondly, I'm working mostly in the Canadian Arctic, and I can see that native peoples, societies or communities didn't only suffer or adapt to climate changes during the Holocene, but also, of course, colonial movements. So the exploration of the Canadian Arctic by Europeans played a huge role in terms of wiping out communities, societies. As you know, when the native peoples, the Haida Gwaii on the Canadian West Coast and the Queen Charlotte Island region, or the Paleo Inuit came in contact with European whalers, for example, they were wiped out sometimes due to epidemics brought in and their very weak immune system. So that is just to echo the comment by Graham Morton that I think the climate human health connection plays a really important role in some regions.
Yeah, I strongly agree with that.
Thank you, Dagomar. Yes, probably with the situation we had late last year, this was a comment that had to be raised here. So thank you very much again for your excellent talk, and thank you all for joining us. And well, you know that the TK seminar series will continue in 2 weeks on the 29th of September with a talk by Ed Hawkins about connecting paleo reconstructions and instrumental records. So we hope you will join us, and thank you again, and we look forward to see you soon. Thank you very much.